Hello and welcome to the TF1 Show. I am your host, Tinus Ferreira, the windsock that can provide invaluable guidance in the typhoon that is the world of F1. So, given that we are once again stuck in this rut between F1 race weekends, I thought it most appropriate to discuss the storm brewing between Ferrari and its two very skilled and capable drivers, Sebastian Vettel and Charles Leclerc. Now, last week during and after the Russian Grand Prix, we were treated to quite the show of intrigue, defiance and arguing over the radio, and it showed us that things were not all as well as Mattia Binotto would like us to believe. So before we get into the meat of today's episode, let's perhaps create some context. Now, for those of you who don't know, and I would be very surprised if there are many, Sebastian Vettel is a four-time world champion at Red Bull, or he became a four-time world champion at Red Bull, and in 2015 he went to Ferrari in a blaze of glory and German patriotism, ready to go and emulate his childhood hero Michael Schumacher and become world champion at Ferrari. Alas, it's been a tough few years for old Sebastian, where he had to deal with an inconsistent Ferrari team, a rampant Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes, and a series of haphazard brain cramps that Vettel, that left him close but with no cigar. Then we get to Mr. Charles Leclerc, who was, touted as one of the young prodigies, similar to, Lewis Hamilton in his day, Max Verstappen and Stoffel van Dorn a few years back, where, he won the GP3 and Formula 2 championships in his rookie year. He then did 1 year at Alfa Romeo Sauber Formula 1 team, where he was exemplary and he did such a good job there. And before you know it, he was announced as Sebastian Vettel's new teammate for 2019. Now, I'm going to be honest, when I heard the news, I was so very excited and intrigued, since I knew this was going to be a very, very hard test for Sebastian Vettel. And so it turned out to be. Now, I'm sure most of you listening would have followed the F1 season in some way or form, but, if I can give you a quick summary of what happened between the two. So initially, Ferrari team boss Mattia Binotto came out and said that, they're not going to have an explicit number one and number two driver, but in situations where it's a 50-50 call between the two, they will rather back Sebastian Vettel, given his experience and his list of achievements, if you can call it that. In other words, Sebastian Vettel would get preferential treatment in the scenario where it wasn't clear between Vettel or Leclerc who was going to be ahead. People weren't too surprised. I also wasn't too surprised, given it's only Leclerc's second year in F1. He's very much a rookie within the team, and Ferrari is a notoriously difficult team to be a part of, given the expectations from the team itself, the media pressure, and just the all-around sort of history and tradition that the team brings with it. And we saw it play out quite a few times in the opening few races in Australia and in China, where Ferrari effectively used team orders to ensure Vettel stayed ahead, even though it might be argued in some cases that Leclerc was the fastest driver. The races thereafter followed, and Leclerc showed signs of extreme brilliance and some serious speed, but Vettel was the more consistent driver, and he was at the end of it scoring more points than his young Monegasque, and Ferrari seemed vindicated in their assessment that Vettel is going to be the driver to back, at least for the 2019 season. But then at around the French Grand Prix, things started to change, where Leclerc sorted out some of the issues he'd been having in terms of qualifying and in terms of making a few mistakes. And Vettel had that race in Canada where he won on the road, but he made a slight mistake, which then meant that Hamilton got the victory over Vettel, with Vettel getting a 5-second penalty. And that seemed to sort of change Vettel's season for the worse, because he's been on a bit of a streak of making a few mistakes in the races, and that seemed to continue. And then coupled with that, Leclerc seemed to find his speed and consistency, and then basically went on a qualifying streak where I think he's now outqualified Vettel for 8 or 9 races in a row, which is quite a serious statistic if you take into account that Vettel is sort of known for being a very, very good qualifier. Now, that then obviously meant that when we got to sort of the Ferrari tracks, if you can call it that, sort of the circuits that were more friendly to the Ferrari design and the Ferrari package, in other words, the Belgian Grand Prix and the Italian Grand Prix, that Leclerc was very much in a good position given his form over qualifying to win the race. And in Belgium, it turned out to be so, given that Leclerc put himself on pole, beating Vettel by quite a big margin. I think it was 7/10, which is quite a big margin over one lap. And he duly went on to win the race, and also taking some help from Sebastian Vettel, who, in the name of team spirit and team camaraderie, held up Lewis Hamilton in his Mercedes for a couple of laps, which effectively, I think, helped Leclerc to win the race at the end, which was, I guess, fair play from Vettel, and I think the team was very grateful for Vettel's efforts. But now we then went on to the Italian Grand Prix, and then all of a sudden things got really interesting, because I think Vettel started to realize, firstly, it's the Ferrari home race, and there's a lot of pressure on both himself and on Leclerc, because everybody kept saying, and it was sort of a well-known fact, that Ferrari had the perfect car for the Monza circuit. It was incredibly fast on the straights, and it didn't have to negotiate a lot of slow corners, which then meant that this was probably Ferrari's best chance to win a race, and then even more importantly than that, to win their home race. And I think both Vettel and Leclerc were desperate to be the driver to win that race for Ferrari. And then in qualifying, now I'm sure most of you will remember the sort of idiotic fast that was the end of Q3, so I'm not going to go into that. But Leclerc did not seem too keen to give Vettel the aerodynamic slipstream that was so important around the Monza circuit and that was so beneficial to the driver behind, even though Vettel gave Leclerc the slipstream on their first run in Q3, which put Charles Leclerc in pole position, or provisional pole position at that point in time. Now, obviously, nobody ended up having their last runs in Q3, and Sebastian Vettel was not pleased. And I think he was sort of still quite pragmatic and quite politically correct with the press, but you can see, and I think you can sort of deduce from the messaging from the Ferrari team itself, that Vettel was not amused by Leclerc's reluctance to reciprocate what Vettel effectively gave him earlier on in the qualifying session. And from then on, things just started to sour a bit. Vettel ended up making another mistake in the race. Leclerc won the Grand Prix with a very, very impressive performance over Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. And then a few weeks after in Singapore, very much a similar thing happened, where Leclerc put the car on pole, but then this time in the race, Vettel got the undercut due to a strategy call by Ferrari, which then meant that Vettel ended up winning the race, despite the fact that Leclerc was probably the faster car. And then lastly, in Russia, as I've mentioned in the introduction, Vettel effectively ignored team orders, even though Ferrari repeatedly asked him to let Leclerc pass, given that he got the advantage from Leclerc at the start with the slipstream. So, I mean, now with all of this drama, I have to say that it's probably going to be inevitable that this driver pairing ends up in a big fat mess, unless one of them decides to leave the team. Now, in this case, it's probably going to have to be Vettel, since Leclerc was bred to be the next great Ferrari driver, at least until Mick Schumacher arrives. We'll probably be doing another episode like this when that happens, when you have Schumacher and Leclerc in one team. But anyways, let's not go down that rabbit hole now. I think then, if you listen to this podcast a bit earlier in the year, you will remember that we all anticipated some fireworks between the two. And the main reason for this is that it is very, very difficult to have two drivers who both want to be the number one driver in the team, especially if you're driving for a top team like Ferrari, and even more so if it is Ferrari, which is probably the most illustrious team in Formula One, given all of its history and achievements. Now, I think to give a bit more context to this episode specifically, I think the message that I'm trying to convey is that everything that is unfolding this year between Vettel and Leclerc is not a new thing. The whole idea of an established champion being in a team with a young new prodigy showing up happened exactly like this 12 years ago, when McLaren announced Lewis Hamilton will be the teammate of Fernando Alonso in 2007. So what, you may ask, happened there? Now, let me explain. Fernando Alonso was signed to McLaren in, a massive fanfare. It was all over the news. It was a massive signing by McLaren and Ron Dennis at the time. Given that Alonso was the two-time defending world champion, he won with Renault in 2005 and 2006. And Alonso arrived and basically claimed that he was promised by McLaren to be the unilateral number one driver at the team, with Lewis Hamilton being the supporting act. Now, Lewis Hamilton, very much like Charles Leclerc now, had just come off winning the GP2 title as a rookie, effectively dominating the junior categories and being an absolute dominant force in karting as well. He was sort of the McLaren golden boy. He's grown up with the team. He was basically groomed for that McLaren seat. And he arrived there with a lot of people's eyes on him, uncertain as to how he would compare against this very much vaunted two-time world champion in Fernando Alonso. And I think after Australia, Fernando Alonso started to realize that Hamilton was not going to be a pushover, given that Hamilton actually outqualified him at their first race. And as the race unfolded, Alonso did end up ahead of Hamilton and did finish ahead of Hamilton at the Australian Grand Prix. But I still think that, Hamilton sent a strong message to Alonso. And as it turned out, after 9 races, Hamilton was leading the championship after taking 9 consecutive podiums in a row. And he won the Canadian and the United States Grand Prix with, and then quite interestingly, during the Monaco Grand Prix, Hamilton was actually upset when McLaren pitted him earlier than expected, given that he actually wanted to race Alonso directly, and McLaren, effectively by making him take the pit stop, didn't allow him to. Now, Hamilton then made a few comments to the press afterwards that alluded to the fact that McLaren was effectively using team orders, which at the time was illegal and not allowed. Now, this obviously did not go down well with the team, and I think they expressed their displeasure to Hamilton as well. Now, the relationship between Hamilton and Alonso then became decidedly more businesslike and slightly frosty, since Hamilton kept outperforming or challenging Alonso, who was a two-time defending world champion. And given that Alonso went in with the expectation of being an undisputed number one in the team, with Hamilton supporting him in his chase for a third world championship, that didn't fly with Fernando Alonso at all. And he felt that the team was deliberately giving Hamilton an advantage due to him being British. And he actually came out to the Spanish press saying that, which then obviously caused a bit of a PR headache for McLaren at the time. Now, all of this sort of underlying tension and drama came to a head in Hungary at the Hungarian Grand Prix, where Hamilton did not adhere to the pre-agreed running order in qualifying. Just as a sidebar, that sounds familiar, doesn't it, given what happened to Leclerc and Vettel in Monza. And subsequently, Alonso was incensed. He then parked in the pit box for longer than required and prevented Hamilton from setting his final flying lap, which then meant Alonso was on pole. But what Alonso forgot about is that there's a rule against deliberately impeding someone else in the pits, which then meant he got a penalty. Hamilton then won the race and extended his lead in the championship. Now, what then ended up happening was effectively the most dramatic period in Formula One, probably in Formula One history, where Alonso then infamously blackmailed Ron Dennis with the Spygate scandal. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole story around Spygate, but effectively McLaren got some specifications of Ferrari's car that year, who was their main competitors, illegally, and they obviously had that information and used it in some way or form with either designing their car, developing their car, and Alonso was aware of this, although Lewis Hamilton wasn't. And Alonso basically threatened Ron Dennis by saying, listen, if Ron doesn't control Lewis Hamilton, and the fact that Hamilton is constantly working against him and the team, that he will go public with this information and effectively cause Ron Dennis a massive, massive reputational risk. Now, Ron Dennis refused to indulge Alonso in his threats, but this then obviously broke down the trust between the team and between Alonso, and this led to a very frosty last few races, and it also led to McLaren Lewis Hamilton taking the eye off the ball, which was winning the World Championship. Now, Hamilton was leading the World Championship at that time quite comfortably, with Kimi Raikkonen and Fernando Alonso switching between second and third between the two of them. Now, Hamilton and Dennis actually admitted to as much when Hamilton crashed in the China pit lane on massively overworn tyres, where they said they forgot about Massa and Raikkonen because they were effectively trying to race Alonso. Now, the rest is history. Hamilton lost the championship to Kimi Raikkonen by 1 point in the last race, and he ended up tying Alonso. However, on countback, Hamilton actually ended up ahead of Alonso in the World Championship. And Alonso left McLaren after 1 year in a blaze of fire and fury, having burnt basically all of his bridges with Ron Dennis and then with Mercedes as well, who was the engine suppliers at the time. Now, this begs the question, where does this leave our dear friends Sebastian and Charles, and even more importantly, where does this leave team boss Mattia Binotto and Ferrari? Now, after how this year went, with Charles outscoring Vettel since the summer break, he incorrectly thought that Vettel wasn't going to react and that he'll just roll over. Now, it's very important to remember that Sebastian Vettel is not an easy customer, and Ferrari seems to have forgotten that. Everybody seems to have conveniently forgotten how Vettel was as a driver, even during his Red Bull years when he was winning all of the championships, where he effectively did not accept anything else or anything other than being the number one driver at the team. If you remember the Multi-21's sort of controversy in Malaysia, where the team effectively ordered Sebastian Vettel to not overtake Mark Webber, who was in the lead. Vettel ignored the team orders, overtook Webber, won the race, and then didn't really feel bad about it at all. He effectively came back the next race and said, he's sorry, but actually he's not really that sorry. And that should give you a very important indication as to what type of competitor Sebastian Vettel is. He's ruthless. He has won 4 world championships, and you don't win 4 world championships by not being incredibly selfish and incredibly single-minded in your quest for that title. Now, Vettel publicly ignoring team orders during the Russian Grand Prix is his way of saying that Ferrari needs to remember who he is and who they are dealing with. He's a very proud, egotistical and fast 4-time world champion who has put everything in developing Ferrari into the team threat that they are now. And it's quite interesting, actually, just as a bit of an aside, that Lewis Hamilton put it to the media during the Russian Grand Prix that Sebastian helped Ferrari to develop that car and to develop the car that Leclerc has now gotten into and has now taken the race victories with, which I think is a very important fact to remember. And I think it's definitely something that Vettel is very much trying to reinforce, that this is the team he built, or he at least had a part in building, and Leclerc just pitching up, getting into the car, and then basically driving to all of these race victories is very much in part due to Vettel's contribution. But the thing is, this is a valid point, but there's also the matter of raw speed, where Leclerc just seems to have the advantage over Vettel at the moment. I mean, there's no way to argue that Leclerc has been doing the better job. Vettel hasn't been doing the job correctly, and that might be in part due to the actual setup of the car and the characteristics of the car's handling very much not being in line with his preferred driving style, which is something that I maybe dealt with a bit more in the episode I did on Vettel specifically. But the fact is, Leclerc is the better performing driver at the moment. And I think, speaking of Leclerc, what happened in Russia will also now mean that he will realize that he can't trust Vettel to not act in his own interest. Even though he did come out afterwards and say no, he still trusts Sebastian and he trusts the team, and that they as a team will continue to work together. I think he must realize, and I don't think he's not a stupid guy. He must now know that Vettel, given the relevant situation, Vettel will act in his own interest, which then probably means that Leclerc will then also in future try and take things more into his own hands when he deems it necessary. Now, what this means for the team is that it can potentially lead to a catastrophic fallout, similar to what we saw at McLaren in 2007 with Alonso leaving after 1 year, or maybe even what happened with Mercedes from 2014 to 16 with Hamilton and Rosberg, where both of the drivers effectively refuse to cede the supremacy to the other. Now, this is exactly what Ferrari does not want, given that their car seems to now be improving and ramping up to be competitive for the 2020 season. Now, the 2019 season, I think, is pretty much done and dusted, so I think they're not worried about this year's championship. But next year's championship, if they can continue with this trajectory of their car development and their car performance, they are going to be in the running for both the Constructors and the Drivers' World Championships, and they don't want any of the drama that McLaren had 12 years ago. Otherwise, they're probably going to end up losing the championship to the very well-oiled machine that is Mercedes, or even Red Bull if they can somehow produce a championship-winning car. Now we need to ask ourselves, what lessons can Ferrari learn from McLaren 12 years ago? Now, firstly, hopefully they don't have like a massive scandal or secret that they are sort of hiding from the media and the public. Now, if there could be anything like that, and I seriously doubt that there is, maybe something around the engine being so much more powerful than the others, or the engine modes in qualifying. I don't know, but that's probably just me speculating and looking for some drama. So let's move on from that one. They would also need very, very strict rules of engagement, similar to what Mercedes ended up using between Hamilton and Rosberg when they were having so many incidents with each other. This effectively means that both drivers need to understand that no one is bigger than the team, no one is bigger than Ferrari, which is a principle that the team and the late Enzo Ferrari lived by very strongly and very passionately. So they're going to have very strict rules around who is allowed to do what, who, for example, is going to get the slipstream during every qualifying session. If you are qualify on pole, or if you're the lead driver in qualifying, you will get some strategic advantages, or you can get first choice of pit stop. Otherwise, they just need to have very hard and fast rules as to who can do what in any situation to make sure that no driver can take things into their own hands. And if they do, they can effectively immediately be punished for it, which I think is very important for Ferrari now. So if any driver does not adhere to the policy, the consequences will have to be severe, which then also means that Ferrari will need to stop playing silly games with strategy and let their drivers race, albeit without ever allowing them to collide. If they are ever in a proper fight for the championship, this might end up happening like what we saw with Hamilton and Rosberg in the Mercedes years, where if they don't have anyone else to fight with, they will fight with themselves. And that's something they can't afford, because the Mercedes team is a very formidable and strong team, and they have a very good driver dynamic between Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas, where they both respect the rules, but historically it has been well known that Bottas doesn't quite have the speed or capability that Hamilton has, which means Hamilton will probably again be spearheading the championship charge for Mercedes, and Ferrari needs to figure out who will be spearheading their charge for their world championship, given that they also can't have two drivers taking points off each other and letting Mercedes run away with it. Now, lastly, I have to say that with the way things are looking now, Vettel's stay at Ferrari after 2020 looks dubious at best. They now have a super fast young driver who is now a proven race winner and a hard racer, and he looks to have the number of Sebastian, especially on a Saturday. It's going to be up to Vettel to convince the team that he is still the man to bring home the championship for them, but he's going to have to tread a very fine line between playing within the rules and doing everything in his power to stop the momentum of his teammate. So, ladies and gents, that's where I will leave today's discussion. Will Vettel take the Alonso route and leave the team where he no longer feels welcome and burn some serious bridges along the way? Or will Vettel do what Alonso wouldn't and take back his crown from his young superstar teammate? What do you, dear listener, think Ferrari and Vettel should do? Please give me your thoughts in the comment section or on Twitter or on Instagram, and we'll be back for the Japanese Grand Prix in a week's time, even though at the moment there seems to be a risk that a typhoon hitting that region of Japan might lead to the cancellation of the race. I will keep you in the loop throughout the week, and hopefully we can soon reflect on another brilliant Grand Prix in 2019. Bye.